sure there would be a little boy in there, and there was a 6-year-old boy in bed with this supposed priest. Now, the eyewitness testimony that a boy was in bed with an old man doesn't do anything in the courtroom. It doesn't prove that there was sex going on. If the little boy testifies, who is going to take the word of a little boy against the word of, say, a real priest?
And what little boy is going to say that a priest
violated. It's a hard arrest to make. It's hard to get a warrant. It's hard to get an arrest. It's hard to get a conviction. And then it's hard to get a real sentence. Very hard. Nobody wants to put anybody away on this kind of charge because the evidence is, by its nature, very, very shaky.
And very controversial as well, and that just points to another facet of this problem, is that often it's just ignored, preferentially ignored by the courts and by the police and by society because they just don't want to believe it's happening. I remember when we did our reports, we thought it significant enough, because the nature of the case involves some Austin personnel and citizens, that we put it on the front page, because I was shocked personally by it. And when we printed these stories, we just were barraged with letters from people saying, basically, I don't want to read this kind of stuff over my morning coffee. You know, even though it happened, even though we documented it, and we'd gone out of our way to make sure that it was all backed up with fact, people just refused to want us, not only to believe it, but to even believe that it happens. So that's part of the problem. And another part of the problem is, of course, we were shocked when we found out the extent and broad nature of this problem of pederasty and what all it involves. But we were truly shocked when we found out initially when we started this a few years back, that the police department didn't even know what pederasty was. I mean, I won't say the police department, but I know that I was dealing with one officer in Sex Crimes Division who's no longer in Sex Crimes Division. And I was trying to do my part for truth and justice and trying to get to the root of the problem. And I said, well, tell me about your case history of pederasty. And he just went blank. He had no idea what I was talking about. Now, to their credit, I will say that the Austin Police Sex Crimes Division has come a long way since then. But if the police don't know what it is, then certainly most members of society won't know what it is. So when they see it in the papers, and editors don't know what it is, so they're not going to print it in the first place, but occasionally when it does go through, society just writes it off as an aberration, a very,
well, how are the police organized? You mentioned Sex Crime Division, but there's also the Vice Squad. So what's
Sex Crimes Division is a subset of Vice.
No, it's part of homicide in almost every city.
Oh, is it?
It's part of homicide. Vice has to do with pornography, obscenity, prostitution, things involving consenting adults, which may be crimes if they're performed in public or commercially. A sex crime is something that involves a direct violation of the law or involves things with kids or child pornography.
Do you have a feel for, say, the budget and the number of personnel in vice squads compared to sex crime divisions in various places?
No, I really don't, Frank. It's something I ought to know more about.
In other words, the emphasis the police department places on one.
I do in Austin, at that time anyway. At that time they had 3 people in the entire sex crimes division, and they were so overworked with just, that's when the choker rapist was around and what have you, and I mean that pretty much exhausts their time. And they were concerned about the issue, but they just said, frankly, we're not staffed. We don't have the personnel to do it.
Rape is a major crime. The incidence is high. Attempted rape is common. It's extremely hard to track down a rapist. These guys are working extremely hard, and then we charge them with the duty of cleaning up the streets. And in Austin, the streets are clean. In Houston, they're not. But how can they go behind the walls and find out what's going on indoors? That's extremely hard to do.
Has there been much investigation by any police or the FBI or the judicial system of this phenomenon? Or is it that it's a fairly recent phenomenon, or is it just something that they haven't dealt with historically or currently?
There have been legislative investigations. There was a national investigation a couple of years ago looking toward the goal of national legislation to protect kids. But no, there hasn't been much.
There are some who would like to tell us that the problem does not exist. that to say Houston is a major center for boy prostitution is to overstate the case. That is what the Houston police tell us.
There again, it's not, we don't have as many male prostitutes as we do female prostitutes. But when you start talking about juvenile boys, 14, 15, 16 years old, 2 or 3 cases are too many. And we do have a few of those.
Well, how would you, talking about that a little further, how would you define the problem of young boy prostitution in Houston as far as the size of the problem?
Well, I'm not going to say it's one of the major problems of our city. Again, we have a certain amount of it, and it's our intention to try to keep the lid on it to keep it from getting anywhere.
Listen to Atlanta Police Sex Crimes Detective Douglas McCoy, a 10-year veteran.
It is almost, at this point, especially at this time of the year, almost an epidemic.
Yet only a very few young boys are ever arrested.
In 1978, there were 7. So far in 1979, we've had 3 male prostitution charges.
The facts are the Atlanta Police Department is understaffed. Vice and sex crime detectives carry a heavy workload. Rapes, for example, are up almost 100% this year. Boy prostitution is near the bottom on the priority list.
Local police have to change their attitudes towards the boys, thinking of them more as victims than as criminals. The change in philosophy has worked for the Los Angeles Police Department and serves as an example for other cities.
When you've got a 15-year-old boy out on the street selling his body, you've got to understand why he's out there. It's usually due to a poor home life. He's there to obtain the necessities of life. And you've got to look at that boy as a victim. Even though he's out there committing the crime of prostitution, you still have to look at him as a victim and why he's out there.
When you do bring them in, what do you do with them? You certainly don't just throw them in the county jail somewhere.
It takes us anywhere from 2 to 6 hours to interview.
You talk to one of these boys for 2 to 6 hours when you first get them in?
Yes, sir. Initially, they don't have trust in the police department because usually they've had contact with uniformed policemen, and the uniformed policeman will book them curfew or run away, and they're sort of leery of the police department. But we'll sit down and we'll gain the kid's confidence. We'll talk to him. We'll tell him if he is involved in anything, that he has anything having to do with sex, that he has done nothing wrong at all. And we treat them the best we can. We'll keep in contact with the victims, and we keep calling them weeks later, and we'll go out and we'll buy them lunch. And
this is weeks later. You go out and get together and see how the boys
see how
doing.
They're doing, progressing, and they call us quite a bit.
Rehabilitation for young boy prostitutes necessitates a change in the way they are handled by penal institutions. In San Francisco, boy prostitutes from around the nation congregate near some of the plushest hotels. But in San Francisco, a boy prostitute who was arrested is given special treatment. Sheriff Richard Hungisto has set up a new program to deal with young boys.
The heterosexual inmates are very likely to abuse, to rape the younger person or the person they think has had homosexual experiences on the streets. They will take advantage of them by force, and sometimes they will be very, very brutal. It's a problem amongst children, juveniles, and adults.
So what has been your answer here?
We house the gay inmates separately. We don't mix them in with heterosexual population just for that reason. And of course the same thing is true with juveniles.
So as you view this problem and people like this come in off the street, how do you handle it?
Well, what we do here is to do what we can to make sure that if there are any psychological problems that they're dealt with, and also to try to aid them with post-release help, giving them opportunities as much as we can to find a job, to have a place to stay, and to get back on their feet so that they don't have to sell their bodies to make money.
Here in Austin, the sex crime unit now is, to my observation, a solid unit doing the best it can. And they have something that's rare in the whole state. They have an officer whose sole job is to counsel the victims of sex crimes. She's an old student of mine, a friend of mine. Her job was funded by the U.S. government. She lost her job in the Reagan budget last month. And she had to lobby in the city council to get retained as a police officer. They've retained her for a year. But the overall budget was cut, and her job, will remain in jeopardy. And it's a vital job.
If I could just add to the problems of investigation and how Tom and I learned about all this. We just finally realized that Tom, thankfully, has carried on and updated the material and kept a close look. My full participation only lasted for a period of about 6 months to a year.
When you were a reporter?
When I was a reporter. And myself and another former editor of the Daily Texan, just as soon as we got hooked on it, I mean, as soon as we found out what was going on, we went after it with entire abandon for a good period of 3 to 6 months. Almost every day we forgot our classes, we forgot our work at the newspaper, we were determined to get to the root of it. And after 6 months, we had touched the tip of the iceberg, and we realized at that time, after spending inordinate amounts of time, money, and energy, which we didn't have to spend already, that we needed to be funded by some sort of organization much larger than ourselves, and a staff much larger than ourselves, to continue to find out really what was going on. So I can see how law enforcement agencies, with what little funding they have, particularly during a tax time such as ours, that it's hard to do. And as I said, the more we found out, the more questions propped up, and the deeper it became.
There's so many things. If it's all right to range around a little bit here, it ought to be said that in academia there's been virtually no contribution. I learned about this whole phenomenon as a teacher when a student of mine called my attention to the TV documentary Boys for Sale, which was made in Houston. I was embarrassed that I didn't know anything about the subject, mentioned it to sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, social workers. They didn't know anything about it either. Then I went into the bibliography and found that it was first meager, and second, heavily oriented toward the defense and explication of the pederast, like the lawyer's commentary I quoted to you. It's considered a dirty subject, and people aren't supposed to go into it. Every semester when I lecture on it, I have students get up and walk out. I used to have complaints made to the department, to the college, to the university, and so on, that I was doing pornographic things in the classroom. That's abated, but people still get upset and walk out. Maybe not because they are offended, but because they're emiscerated by it and they want to get away from it.
People don't like to look at reality.
Well, especially
as real as it.
This stuff is horrible. At any rate, if the police department from any major city went over to the major educational institution in its area and asked for a contribution from the faculty, that faculty could contribute practically nothing. Academics have been not necessarily remiss, but they have been oblivious to this.
Can I ask you, unless it would compromise your information system, how do you go about getting your information?
Observation, interviewing, and interviewing of many kinds. Interviewing kids, interviewing people who are willing to talk, who are on the other side of the street, so to speak, and investigators.
Have you written any books, or are you planning any articles or studies on this?
I'm working on a book, and I expect it will not be the last book that I'll write about the subject, and I'll be teaching a course on it in the spring, and as far as I know, it'll be the first one ever taught in an American college.
Can we talk about the mass media treatment? We've kind of hit on it here and there. From what I seem to get, the electronic media, particularly a couple of TV stations, have done most of the work on it, and the newspapers haven't done much.
With the exception of Mark and Gary Fendler.
Right, with the exception of the Texan.
Well, it's interesting. Throughout all the things that we did, which we thought, and perhaps we were in a minority, but we thought it was information that was in the best public interest to know, or at least be exposed to, was not touched by any other local media in town.
Do you have any explanation for this? Why didn't the Austin American Statesman pick up on it?
I really don't know.
Or the TV station? Did you ever take it to them?
But actually, I think the Statesman did run one or two. I think they ran the initial story about Anderson, the pharmacist being busted, and that's what sparked our interest. And of course,
and they dropped it.
Did you ever talk to the reporter that did that story and see why they didn't pursue the...
No, I don't think I did. I think we got so wrapped up in what we were doing.
What about down in Houston? Is there any evidence of pressure to keep the lid on down there?
Well, when Boys for Sale was shown on TV, it was shown first as a nightly series, and then there was a summary program, which you'll have excerpts of. The biggest bank in Houston withdrew its advertising from the show and from the station because it showed that program.